thank you so much, everyone, for coming. As an author and a Catholic, I just really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you. And I wanted to start tonight with a little story. So one spring day, while I was writing this book, and public masses were suspended because of COVID, a tornado came to my house. And earlier that morning, I remember I had glanced outside and just kind of stared at this dark and menacing cloud. But I remember going on my phone to see what the storm chasers had to say. And they were in the area, and they basically said everything was okay. So I didn't go in the storm shelter, and I just stayed in my house and went about my morning. Well, soon the power went out, and then rain started pounding, and it started forcing its way under the door, the front door of my house. And then it was kind of confusing what was happening, and then I looked outside out a window, and I saw that the huge old tree in our backyard had been ripped out of the ground by the roots, and you could see the exposed roots everywhere. And only later did I learn, after several days with no power, that an EF1 tornado had come up my driveway and had mysteriously stepped to the side of my house and gone on the rest of its path. So I was lucky. It was an EF1, and the damage was to outbuildings and to the big bodark tree in the backyard. But I've been thinking about this episode because I feel like you and I as Catholics, we've been living through a spiritual tornado outbreak for so long that we are kind of inured to it and kind of used to it. It's become just a kind of regular occurrence when we hear another bad piece of news about what's going on in the church that we love. So I wanted to talk about the third secret of Fatima, and about how there's this part where the seers saw a man identified as the Pope moving through a big city half in ruins. And this is what Bishop Athanasius Schneider has to say about this half-ruined city. Quote, "This means that the spiritual situation of the church is in ruins, the consequence of a process of spiritual demolition in doctrine, liturgy, and the moral life. From the spiritual point of view, the church in our days is half destroyed by heresies and by doctrinal confusion, by chaos in the liturgy, by the chaos of immorality," unquote. So today I want to talk about some of that damage, and I want to talk about it in relation to a mysterious group called the St. Gallen Mafia. So the St. Gallen Mafia, if you're kind of new to that term, it was a group of high-ranking churchmen who met from about 1996 to 2006 at or near St. Gallen, Switzerland, and their goal was to plot a revolution in the church. And the really key idea here to understand about this group is that they were existentially defined by their opposition to Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. And in my book, I talk about the Mafia's attempts to prevent Ratzinger's election and then to sabotage his program once he's Pope and to try to make him a kind of transitional figure. And about 5 years into Benedict's papacy, the opposition to him from multiple sides was so intense that 2 Italian journalists wrote a book called Attack on Ratzinger. And at one point, to me, this was one of the most fascinating parts of this book. They described a vision that Jacinta of Fatima had of the Pope. And here's how her cousin Lucia describes it. Quote, "One day, our siesta was spent down by my parents' well. Jacinta sat on the stone slabs on top of the well. Francisco and I climbed up a steep slope in search of wild honey among the brambles in a nearby thicket. After a little while, Jacinta called out to me, 'Didn't you see the Holy Father?' 'No.' 'I don't know what it was, but I saw the Holy Father in a very big house, kneeling by a table, with his head buried in his hands, and he was weeping. Outside the house, there were many people, and some of them were throwing stones. Others were cursing him and using bad language. Poor Holy Father, we must pray very much for him." So the writers of Attack on Ratzinger raised the possibility that this vision applied in some way to Benedict. Now, earlier in that book, Attack on Ratzinger, they had spoken of a powerful Italian cardinal who had said the day after Benedict's election, quote, 2 or 3 years, he will only last 2 or 3 years, unquote. And according to a different unnamed cardinal, since Benedict's pontificate lasted more than 2 or 3 years, the attacks against him proliferated. So very interestingly, in 2010, Benedict himself talked about what, quote unquote, new things we could learn from the third secret of Fatima. And just to refresh our memories, this is part of the third secret. Quote, "And we saw in an immense light that is God, something similar to how people appear in a mirror when they pass in front of it, a bishop dressed in white. We had the impression that it was the Holy Father." And then skipping ahead a little bit, "The Holy Father passed through a big city, half in ruins and half trembling with halting step, afflicted with pain and sorrow. He prayed for the souls of the corpses he met on his way. Having reached the top of the mountain, on his knees at the foot of the big cross, he was killed by a group of soldiers who fired bullets and arrows at him," unquote. So this is such a rich and dense passage, and there are so many mysteries that Benedict could have gestured toward. He could have discussed why there was this reference to the mirror and the bishop dressed in white. Why didn't they just call him the Pope? They did have the impression it was the Holy Father, but they don't immediately call him the Holy Father. Benedict could have talked about why this Holy Father was killed with arrows. That's a strange detail. But Benedict, he chose to stress something else. And this is what he said, quote, "Attacks on the Pope and the Church come not only from without, but the sufferings of the Church come precisely from within the Church," unquote. So I want to return here to that image of the spiritual tornado outbreak. And I want to add the detail that what we're talking about right now is driven by winds within the church. And I want to talk about just some of the storms and some of the damage associated with the Gallen Mafia. So let's look at it in terms of some of the key players. So if we think of, for instance, Cardinal Godfrey de Niels, he was a progressive Belgian mafia member, and he was accused by multiple people of having told the Belgian king to sign an abortion law. And his own biography says that he secretly wrote a letter congratulating a politician for the passage of legislation on same-sex unions. De Niels was also caught on tape telling a sexual abuse victim to stay silent and to even ask for forgiveness from his abuser. And this victim had been abused by his own uncle, a bishop, for over a decade, starting at age 5. And it's heartbreaking because on this tape, there's this moment where the victim says to de Niels, "Why do you feel so sorry for my abuser and not for me? You're always trying to defend him." So that's Cardinal Godfrey de Niels. Now let's talk about Cardinal Achille Silvestrini, the aging Italian diplomat who joined the St. Gallen Mafia a couple of years before Benedict's election. So I'm just going to read from part of the beginning of my book. And this was actually, so little side note here. I started writing this book mainly because I was fascinated with a different figure that I'm going to talk about, Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini. But as I wrote the book, I found that Silvestrini is actually extremely interesting and essential to the plot of the story. So learning about Silvestrini was a very kind of important part of this book. And so here's the beginning of my chapter on him. The night of Pope Benedict's election, a Latin American cardinal ran into Silvestrini on the street close to St. Peter's. Silvestrini was a defeated man. The cardinal saw Silvestrini's dull anger, saw his refusal to accept a papal election that marked the very negation of his life's work. He saw Silvestrini's stubborn notion that Ratzinger would only be a transitional pope. That evening, the cardinal saw that Silvestrini had declared a form of war. So I took that idea of a war, and I have two parts in the book. One part is called War, and one part is called Time. And the whole first part dealing with Benedict it's called War because our sources basically, they're telling us that Silvestrini and the others declared a form of war against Ratzinger. And there were so many things that happened in this war. And the Silvestrini chapter talks about a couple of early maneuvers against Benedict. Namely, there was a conclave diary that was leaked. And a lot of people think that the person who leaked it was Silvestrini. And as I talk about in the book, I think it distorted the voting tallies to try to make it look like Benedict had less supported the conclave than he really did. And kind of a lot of publicity came to this specific conclave diary. And then there was this book that came out, and I didn't know about this book until I started writing the book. And it was a 2007 French book that's translated as Confession of a Cardinal. And the idea is that there is this unnamed powerful cardinal who's just talking very frankly about what he thinks about Ratzinger and the direction for the church, and basically talking about why he would never have voted for Ratzinger. So this cardinal was too old to vote at the 2005 conclave, which is again interesting because Silvestrini was too old to vote at the 2005 conclave. And I and other people, we think it's very likely that this cardinal was Silvestrini. But this is an absolutely fascinating text. And again, the idea was they were trying to convey that in the highest echelons of the church, not everyone was happy with Ratzinger, and a lot of people were already thinking about what happens next. So this very, very short history linked to just a little bit of what happened with Silvestrini. It gives us the tiniest window into the perfect storm that picked up speed and power against Benedict. I'm often asked, did the St. Gallen Mafia force Benedict out, or what's going on with that? And my personal opinion, having tried to look into these things as objectively as possible, is that part of the dynamic. It reminds me to go back to the tornado analogy. As I was writing this speech, I learned about some of those occurrences, like the 1974 super outbreak, where there were 16 tornadoes on the ground at the same time. And it made me think about how many, if you want to call these tornadic events that, were happening during the time of Benedict, and you have some from the St. Gallen Mafia, you have Vatileaks, you have the sexual abuse scandal, you have the antagonism of the world and the media, and what if you had all of them at roughly the same time going on together? I think Benedict probably felt he was too weak, and probably felt that I think he wanted to do the right thing, and I think he thought that the right thing to do was to pass on leadership to someone who was stronger. So that's my personal opinion of what happened. But whatever it was, on February 11th, 2013, on the Feast of Lords, Benedict announced his abdication. And of course, lightning struck twice. Now, when Our Lady came to Fatima at the first apparition on May 13th, 1917, Lucia says that, quote, "We suddenly saw what seemed to be a flash of lightning," unquote. Fearing a thunderstorm, they went down a slope until Lucia says that, quote, "Near a large oak tree, we saw another flash of lightning, and some steps later we saw on a holm oak a lady dressed all in white, brighter than the sun and radiating a light more clear and intense than a crystal glass filled with sparkling water when the rays of the burning sun shine through it," unquote. Well, just 2 months later, on July 13th, 1917, it was already time to show the children the terrible vision of hell. And I'm going to quote this in its entirety. Side note here again, I love to read about the four last things. It does something for my soul. And my favorite book is St. Alphonsus Liguori's Preparation for Death. And one of my other favorite texts to meditate on is, the text of the first secret of Fatima. I just think it does something for the soul. And here it is, quote, "Our Lady showed us a great sea of fire which seemed to be under the earth. Plunged in this fire were demons and souls in human form, like transparent burning embers, all blackened or burnished bronze, floating about in the conflagration, now raised into the air by the flames that issued from within themselves, together with great clouds of smoke, now falling back on every side like sparks in a huge fire, without weight or equilibrium, and amid shrieks and groans of pain and despair, which horrified us and made us tremble with fear. The demons could be distinguished by their terrifying and repulsive likeness to frightful and unknown animals, all black and transparent. This vision lasted but an instant. How can we ever be grateful enough to our kind Heavenly Mother, who had already prepared us by promising in the first apparition to take us to heaven? Otherwise, I think we would have died of fear and terror." Here I'm reminded of that moment when St. John Bosco, an angel tells him, to help save your boys, you need to have some acquaintance with the fires of hell. And if I'm remembering it correctly, it's something like there are all these different rooms and walls, and kind of cordoning off the outer layers of hell from the inner layers. And he was supposed to just touch the wall at the very end, the wall. And he didn't want to. And finally, he's made to touch it. And he cries out with this just frightful cry. And he had been dreaming, but it had been a vision. And even though it had been a vision during a dream, he was left with marks from what had happened. And essentially, these different moments, like the first secret of Fatima, the vision of John Bosco, they are trying to get at a mystery that we can't even comprehend. And so I want you to kind of think about that as we go on to talk about what happened, I believe 35 years to the day after July 13th, 1917, after that vision of hell and the revelation of a fuller secret. 35 years later to the day, a priest was ordained, and he was an Italian, and his name was Carlo Maria Martini, and he was the future leader of the St. Gallen Mafia. Really, this group, the St. Gallen Mafia, it started as Martini's project, and the initial idea was not just to prevent Ratzinger as Pope, it was to elect Martini as Pope. And one of the members of the St. Gallen Mafia, I think it was Cormac Murphy O'Connor, an Englishman, he said that he thinks that if John Paul II had died about 10 years earlier, so around 1995, Martini could have had a chance to be Pope. So Martini was someone who literally, a lot of forces thought he had a great shot at succeeding John Paul II. And this is what Martini had to say about hell during Benedict's pontificate. "I hope that sooner or later God redeems everyone. I am a great optimist," said Martini in night conversations. But regarding sinners such as Hitler, Martini thought it was easier to think that such people are simply extinguished. Martini was trying to explain how, quote, nobody knows if anyone, unquote, is in hell. So if you think about it, this vision of hell that was so important that Our Lady made it the first secret for the children, Martini is here peddling a kind of counter secret on hell. And it is this idea that we don't know if anyone's in hell, and maybe the most evil among us are just annihilated instead of punished by God. And hopefully sooner or later, God redeems everyone. But if we think about that for a moment, Venerable Fulton Sheen says, quote, if there is no hell, then there is no sin. If there is no sin, then there is no judge. And if there is no judgment, then evil is good and good is evil, unquote. So this is what Martini had to say about sin, quote, the church has talked a lot about sin, too much, unquote. And this, quote, the times are long gone when the church could talk you into having a guilty conscience, unquote. So by the time Benedict abdicated in 2013, Martini had already passed away, but the winds of his influence were picking up in the church. In other words, when we think, when I'm asked to summarize the program of the St. Gallen Mafia, inevitably we start using these words like synodality, and we talk about women deacons, and we talk about viri pro body. But what I'm trying to suggest today is the essence of the St. Gallen Mafia program. It had to do with a subversion of Catholic notions of sin and hell. Okay, that was the fundamental spirit, the wind that was blowing. So let's talk about what happened on October 13th, 2014. This was the day that there was a synod on the family under Benedict's successor, Pope Francis, and that synod released its midterm report. And this report was widely understood to have been mainly written by a Martini disciple named Archbishop Bruno Forte. And this report, to quote a Vatican expert, quote, calls for the church to build on positive values and unions that the church has always considered irregular, including cohabitating couples, second marriages undertaken without annulments, and even homosexual unions, unquote. So this is the detail that kind of really gets me. Eyewitnesses say that while this report was being read to the media, because it was not what the Synodal Fathers had wanted, it had been engineered by Forte and other revolutionaries. But while it was being read to the media, and the media was saying things like, earthquake in the church, a major seismic event has happened, church changes, all of these things, Forte, that Martini disciple, he was seen flashing a thumbs up sign to another synodal father. So this was 97 years to the day after the miracle of the sun. And let's talk for just a moment about what the mood was at the miracle of the sun at Fatima. And this is from Sister Lucia's biography. Quote, at one point, the whole crowd started screaming, terrified, confessing aloud their sins, making acts of faith and asking for forgiveness. It seemed that the sun was loosed from the firmament and was coming toward the earth to burn all the people, unquote. And this is what Venerable Fulton Sheen has to say about the same miracle of the sun in the book Communism and the Conscience of the West. Quote, "What significance shall we attach to the apparent fall of the sun attested by the people of Fatima on that October day in 1917? We have no way of knowing for certain, but since its general effect was so frightening, we may speculate. Could it augur the day when men would steal some of the atomic energy from the sun and use it not to light a world, but as a bomb?" So this is the kind of speculation that was going on about what that terrifying, apparent fall of the sun meant. And almost 100 years later, in 2016, the papal document Amoris Laetitia came out. And let me just make two observations about that text. Number one, it was visibly influenced by Martini. I have seen other people point out the passages and where you can hear the echo and you can trace the common words, and I put that in the book. So it was a kind of ventriloquism of Martini at the most important sections. Number two, philosopher Joseph Seifert really zeroed in on section 303. And this was where the text said that conscience can discern that God is, quote unquote, asking one to commit intrinsic wrongs such as adultery. And this led philosopher Joseph Seifert to ask if Amoris Laetitia had just smuggled in a, quote, moral, theological, atomic bomb that threatens to tear down the whole moral edifice of the Ten Commandments and of Catholic moral teaching, unquote. So he wrote that maybe around 2017 or 2018, but these questions are, they're still there. They haven't gone away. I think if they have felt less urgent to us, it's because, as I said, we've been living under tornadic conditions for so long that we've become kind of numb to some of these happenings. So this is the part where I want to shift, and I want to talk about what we do, what we do to address the damage and live out the message of Fatima. And this is the part where I want to speak not just as the author of this book, but also as a millennial cradle Catholic. And I grew up as a child knowing fairly early on about Fatima and Akita and La Salette and much more. It was the 1990s, and it was soon before the year 2000, and I would hear apparitions get discussed all the time on Catholic TV. I was listening even though I was a child, and I also, I would sneak and read my father's books on Catholic prophecy, and I was interested. I was maybe about 10 or so, and I wanted to know something about this. And I remember that there was a secular TV program that came on one day, and they said, and I verified this, I Googled it, and other people remember this and have talked about this on their blogs. But this program talked about how the world was going to end on May 5th, 2000, because the ending of some chamber in some pyramid symbolically coincided with that date. And I don't know, I was maybe 10 or 11 or 12, but I remember imagining what it would be like to be in high school and have the world end on that day. So this kind of, this world of prophecies, I completely grew up in that world. But, that is one of my clearest memories of prophecies about the future, because I think, to be honest, I was a kid, but at that time, I wanted to know about specific dates. I wanted to know about specific events that were going to happen. That's what other people were talking about as well. And I don't remember a ton of talk about penance, about preparation for death, about just the substance of being a Catholic, really. And so the year 2000 came, and of course the world went on. And then one day in about 2016, and I remember that because it was shortly after Amoris came out, something happened that was very, very important in my life. And it was that I found out that a family member of mine, we'll call him Jeremy, was dying of cancer. And Jeremy was a completely non-religious person. I didn't even know if he was baptized. But my very pious father told me that he specifically said this to me. He said that it was important that I encourage Jeremy to go to confession. And I felt totally desperate for help, because I knew that there would be a lot of resistance to that idea, maybe even mockery of that idea. So I did a couple of things. I started reading and meditating on St. Alphonsus Liguori's Preparation for Death every day. I asked Venerable Fulton Sheen to intercede for Jeremy, and I sort of reminded Sheen of all of the people whom he had brought to the confessional. And then I begged a lady, Our Lady, for a sign of her intercession for my own edification. And then my family and I, we worked together. We did the real work of, to borrow a phrase from Venerable Fulton Sheen, he says there is a price tag on every soul, and some are cheap and others are expensive. And he had said that this was a period actually where I was listening to Sheen every day, and I was taking notes on it. Like I just completely inhabited that world. And we had to start the actual work of addressing the price tag on Jeremy's soul. And so, we had recourse to miraculous medals and scapulars, rosaries, fasts for Saturdays, all of that. And one day, Jeremy just kind of brought up out of the blue that he had been baptized as a baby, and so we figured out, oh, you're actually a Catholic, okay. Then we had this moment where I gave him my miraculous medal, and he produced the miraculous medal that had been pinned onto his infant gown when he was a baby by the nuns at the hospital where he was born. And he told me, I guess I've been protected all my life, and I didn't know it. And then we had some major setbacks and scares about his health, and a lot of resistance to the idea of meeting with a priest and going to for any reason. And so we had these moments where things were looking up, these moments where things were looking down. And then one day, Jeremy spontaneously told me that he wanted to see a priest. And we knew of a priest who could meet with him that day, and he did. He met with him for a long time. And it was December 8th, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. And that is a true story from my life. So I want to end with that story. I don't want to end with a story about the members of the St. Gallen Mafia, because what I want to say today is that through the intercession of Our Lady, we can do something about what's going on around us. And there is this verse from the Psalms that is often applied to Mary, and it is, quote, "Glorious things are said of thee, O city of God," unquote. And I want to leave us with that idea. Glorious things are said of thee, O city of God. And I want to humbly encourage everyone to start or continue or repeat the first Saturday's devotion. This Saturday, if I remember correctly, is the first Saturday. That is something concrete that we can do to get Our Lady's intercession for our church and our world and our families. And I want to dedicate this talk to Our Lady of Fatima for the glorious things that she has already done and will do for us. And I'll just end with the Salve Regina. Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae, vita dulcedo, et spes nostra, salve. Ad te clamamus, exules filii Heve, ad te suspiramus, gementes et flentes, in hac lacrimarum vale. Ea ergo, advocata nostra, illus tuos, misericordes oculos, ad nos converte, et Iesum, benedictum fructum ventris tui, nobis, post hoc exilium, ostende. O clemens, O pia, O dulcis, Virgo Maria. Amen. Thank you so much for listening.